talking to you about culture in the 1960s today. And first, I want to talk about Vatican II, which is the second church council that we've talked about this semester. If you remember, Vatican I was in the 1860s, and that's the one that established the idea of papal infallibility with Pope Pius IX. Well, it's almost a century later, and Pope John the 23rd is calling for a new church council to respond to some of the complaints that people had about the Catholic Church and concerns at the time that people were growing away from it. What was different about this council is they invited people of other faiths, Jews and Muslims, and non-Catholic Christians, Protestants, Greek Orthodox, to come to the council. They met for a few years. John the 23rd dies in the middle. Paul VI takes over. And the big change is this is when they allowed the Mass to be said in vernacular. So if you're Catholic today, you can go and hear it in English or whatever your native language is. They changed the priest where he used to stand with his back to the congregation. Now he's turned around, and it was thought that this would involve the congregation more. However, Paul VI explicitly rejected calls for reforming Catholic teaching. He issues a document saying, nope, we're not going to approve of contraception, abortion, or euthanasia. And these are the positions that the church still holds today officially. I'm going to talk specifically about Britain today in the 60s, but a lot of these changes are going on in other countries in Western Europe. It's what would be called the end of the Victorian moral code, and you can see with these changes in laws that happened during the 60s, how that's changing, people's practices, fewer people getting married in a church, and how it's declined over the decades, fewer people having their children baptized in the church. There's this famous obscenity trial in 1960 about a book written by D.H. Lawrence that came out in 1920, but the government had censored portions of the book because there were explicit sex scenes. So they had published an expurgated copy of the book with the naughty bits taken out. But what was really shocking in the story is Lady Chatterley is dissatisfied with her life, and she starts having an affair with the gamekeeper. And to have this affair across a class divide was considered very shocking at the time. Well, Penguin Books decided they wanted to bring the book out in 1960, and they challenged the censorship rulings. And there was this trial, and they brought in authors to testify that this was a work of art and not obscenity. And it didn't help when the prosecutor told the jury, well, this is the kind of book you wouldn't want your wife or servants to read. Well, that didn't go over with the people of the jury about how out of touch he was, and the book was approved. And so this has become a landmark moment in publishing history that established in Britain that books can be published with explicit sexual scenes, and it's not up to the censors to decide what's art and what's not. Another break in how people were regarding those that considered themselves their moral betters is you can see in this famous scandal called the Profumo scandal. Profumo was the Secretary of State for War in the conservative government under Harold Macmillan, and it came out that he had been hanging out with a bunch of other upper-class men at the private estate sleeping with very young women and having parties and naked swimming in the pool and that sort of thing, and some drugs. And he had been sleeping with this woman, Christine Keeler, who was over 30 years younger than he was. I think she was 19 at the time they started. And he came out and he denied this in public and said he had been doing nothing inappropriate. But then more and more of the scandal leaked. And what made it especially disturbing is that she was having an affair with a guy who was a known Soviet spy at the time. This is the height of the Cold War. The Soviets then had a practice of trying to get what they called kompromat against prominent Western politicians, getting them in compromising, scandalous situations, and then blackmailing them later. So eventually this all comes out and he has to resign. And a few months later, Macmillan's conservative government fell. You also see this end of deference in this famous Monty Python skit, if you like Monty Python comedy, called the Upper Class Twit of the Year, where they were having a competition to find who would be the best upper class twit. And so they all play these really stupid, somewhat mentally challenged men, and they do stupid things and run backwards and other things like this. I have the link down here if you want to watch the episode. Something else that was happening in the 60s is BBC Radio had a monopoly on broadcasting music, and they wouldn't broadcast unapproved music. A lot of what was considered underground rock and roll at the time. And so what people did was they would be on a boat off the shore of England and broadcast in. And if you tried, you could pick up the signal and listen to this pirate radio. And people got exposed to a lot of music that BBC wasn't allowing on. Not everyone was happy. There was this woman, Mary Whitehouse, who led a campaign against sex and violence in popular culture and TV and the movies, and tens of thousands of people would come out to hear her and to join in protests with her. So it's very similar to the tensions that we're seeing in America in the 1960s between more radical culture and those who are the silent majority, who are unhappy with what they're seeing. There's also change in sexual roles. There had been this report that had been commissioned in the 1950s to report on homosexual offenses and prostitution. And what it did was it covered about how difficult it was for the police to patrol and control gays. Which was homosexual sex was illegal. They said it was hard to find them. It was too much for them to do. And the recommendation came out to decriminalize homosexual sex. And eventually in 1967, so a decade later, it was decriminalized. Although the age of consent for heterosexual sex at the time was 16, but for gay sex it was 21. And they lower it in the 90s, and then in 2000, finally, it's lowered to 16, so it's the same age as for heterosexual sex. But it's interesting that the motivation for decriminalizing gay sex was not out of sense of gay rights, but because the police were complaining that they were overloaded with the work of having to police homosexual behavior. But there was a gay rights movement. They have their first gay pride parade in 1972, and that grows the sense of, we're out and we're proud was the motto of the movement. We also see a women's movement at the time. women who are fighting for issues like equal pay, equal access to jobs, contraception, abortion on demand, easier divorce laws. So the same sort of issues that are motivating the American women's movement at the time are the same thing that you're seeing in London. A big moment was the Miss World contest in 1970, where you had all the TV cameras were there to broadcast the contestants, but you had women protesters out in the front heckling it, calling it a cattle market, and the master of ceremonies for the show was Bob Hope, the American comedian, and he was making jokes like, "Oh, they call this a cattle market. Well, I've been checking calves out all day long." And then he says, "I never give women a second thought. My first thought covers everything." And tremendously sexist jokes. And this did not go over well. And it's when the British public really becomes aware of the women's movement. You see a difference in how women are depicted at the time. You can see the ideal woman of the 50s was Elizabeth Taylor, who was regarded as the most beautiful woman in the world. But by the 1960s, the most famous model was Twiggy. And you can see she has a much more androgynous figure than Elizabeth Taylor did. But that's how the idea of what is beautiful has been changing and making it much more boyish, quite similar to what we see in the 1920s. There was this bestseller that was written by a man about the joy of sex, and it also brought in some politics things like anti-war, pacifism, anti-nukes. But even though this was about the openness and the attitude towards sex, it was still from the slant of how men can enjoy sex, not talking about women. And then there's this famous book by Australian feminist Germaine Greer called The Female Eunuch, how women are being denied their natural character by the roles that men put them in. Okay, so you can see all these changes that are going on in the 60s, and what's going on in Britain is also going on in other countries in Europe. And it's very parallel to what you see in American history. Okay, talk to you later.